The wind had teeth. It came across the plains without apology, a single, whining note that scoured the land flat and gray. It tasted of dust and distance and the iron chill of a winter that was not yet here but promised to be cruel. On the railway platform, the air was thick with the smells of coal smoke and wet wool, a damp, gritty perfume that clung to the back of the throat. The morning sky was the color of a tarnished spoon, vast and empty, brittle. Yellowed grass beside the tracks bowed low, surrendering to the relentless push of the wind. From the dark mouth of a boxcar, a woman descended. She did not use the small, unsteady stool the station master had kicked into place. Instead, she lowered herself with a careful economy of motion, one hand gripping the iron ladder, the other steadying the single trunk she pushed before her. She landed on the packed earth with a soundless finality, her worn boots making no impression. Her name was Asha, though no one here knew it, and she intended to keep it that way for as long as she could. Her face was a careful mask, her features held in a stillness that was not calm but contained. It was a face that had learned to betray nothing, to offer no purchase for curiosity or cruelty. A thick wool scarf was wrapped high around her neck, its fringe fluttering against her chin. Beneath it, hidden from the world, a pale, puckered scar traced the line of her collarbone, a permanent reminder of a lesson learned in violence. Her hands, resting now on the scuffed leather handles of her trunk, were not the delicate hands of a lady. The palms were calloused, the knuckles chapped and red from work and weather. These were hands that had scraped and fought and held on. The town of Redemption was not so much a town as a raw wound on the prairie, a place of raw lumber and stark ambition. And it watched her, the station master, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, glanced at her once, his gaze sliding past as if she were a piece of unclaimed freight, a woman in a fine bonnet, ushering two small children toward a waiting buggy, pulled them closer to her skirts, her lips a thin, straight line of disapproval. From the doorway of the barber shop, "Mr." Finney paused, his straight razor hovering over a lathered cheek. He leaned and whispered something to the man in his chair, and both men's eyes flickered toward the platform. A quick, shared glance of assessment at the mercantile across the dusty street. The proprietor, Mr. Sterling, stood with his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed, calculating her worth or her threat, which in this place were often the same thing. It was a prejudice of polite silences and clipped stares, an ice that formed in the air around her, more chilling than the wind itself. Asha felt the stares like a physical touch, a series of small, sharp pricks against her skin. She kept her chin level and her eyes fixed on the gray boards of the platform in front of her. Look down. Do not meet their eyes. Do not give them a reason. Be small. Be invisible. The wind cut through her thin dress, a garment more suited to a milder season left far behind, and a shiver racked her body, a deep, bone-rattling tremor she could not suppress. He stood apart from the others, leaning against a support post for the station's overhang, his hat pulled low against the wind. Eben was his name, and he was a man accustomed to solitude. He had a reputation for a hard, quiet pride, a man who kept his own counsel and paid his own debts. His coat, a heavy sheepskin thing worn soft and dark with use, was wrapped tight around him. He was not watching her with the sly curiosity of the barber or the cold appraisal of the shopkeeper. He was watching her shiver. He saw the way her arms were wrapped around her middle, a futile attempt to hoard what little warmth she had. He saw the way she fought to keep her teeth from chattering, the tension in her jaw. He saw her reluctance to meet anyone's gaze, the way she seemed to be trying to shrink into herself, to disappear into the vast, uncaring landscape. Something in him, a tight, old knot of guilt, he carried deep in his gut, loosened just a little. Without conscious thought, he pushed himself off the post and started toward her. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who spent his days on horseback, his boots scuffing quietly in the dirt. He did not speak. The wind snatched at his hat, and he reached up a hand to hold it in place. Asha saw him coming, a tall shape detaching itself from the shadows of the station. A man, walking directly toward her. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. Her breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the ground, weighed down by the heavy trunk and the heavier memories. He stopped a few feet from her, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. She could not read his expression. He began to unbutton his coat. A torrent of images flooded her mind, hot and sharp, firelight dancing on rough faces, the reek of whiskey, the tearing of cloth, hands, strong and cruel, pinning her down, a voice, thick with satisfaction, whispering foul promises in her ear, her own screams, swallowed by a brutal hand. The man before her was shrugging the coat from his shoulders. He held it out. The words escaped her on a choked whisper, a plea torn from the deepest, most terrified part of her. "Please, do not—" It was not a refusal of his charity. It was a desperate prayer against a violation she could not bear to suffer again. "Please do not touch me. Please do not come closer. Please do not remove my clothes." Eben heard the words, and he froze. It was not what she said, but how? The sound was thin and brittle, the sound of something stretched to its breaking point. He looked at her face, truly looked, and for the first time, he saw past the cold to the raw fear in her eyes. It was a fear he recognized, not from his own experience, but from a memory that haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. The memory of a frantic hand slipping from his grasp in the churning, icy water of a flooded river. The memory of a life he had failed to save. That failure had hollowed him out, leaving a cavern of rigid shame he could never quite fill. He had learned then that a man's strength meant nothing if it was applied wrongly, that good intentions could pave a road to hell. He did not retreat. He did not press. He simply paused, holding the heavy coat, letting the moment hang in the frigid air between them. He understood. Or, if he did not understand the particulars of her past, he understood the boundary she had drawn in the dust with her quiet, desperate plea. Slowly, respectfully, he stepped forward. He did not reach for her. He did not try to wrap the coat around her. Instead, he held it open and, with a movement that was almost tender, he settled it over her shoulders. The thick sheepskin fell around her like a weighted blanket. His hands came nowhere near her body. The gesture was impeccably careful, a silent contract of respect. A brief, charged quiet descended upon them. The wind howled, but in their small bubble of space, there was only the sound of their breathing. Neither spoke. The warmth of the coat began to seep into Asha's chilled body, a slow, spreading heat that was both a comfort and a shock. It smelled of him, of leather and horse and cold, clean air. It was an intensely male scent, but for the first time in a long time, it was not threatening. It was just warm. Her body, coiled tight with terror, began to unspool, a fraction at a time, a wary relief, fragile as a spider's web, settled over her. For Eben, the moment was deeply uncomfortable. He felt the rawness of her fear and the echo of his own past failure. To stand so close to another person's pain was a thing he usually avoided at all costs. He had closed himself off long ago to prevent just this kind of ache. Offering the coat had been an instinct, an attempt at a small, quiet restitution for a much larger debt he felt he owed the world. He had not expected it to feel like this, like laying a hand on an open wound. He felt a rigid shame, not for his action, but for the world that had made such an action so fraught with peril for her. He gave a short, stiff nod, a gesture that was both an apology and a dismissal, and stepped back, giving her space. Asha gathered herself, pulling the heavy collar of the coat closer to her chin. The wool was a shield. She bent, her muscles protesting, and gripped the handles of her trunk. She walked away from the station, her head held high, not looking back. She moved through the main street of Redemption, the townsfolk's stares seeming to slide off the heavy sheepskin that now enveloped her. She found lodging in a boarding house at the far end of the street. It was a modest, two-story clapboard house with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The woman who opened the door was a widow named Sarah Gable. She had lines of grief etched around her eyes, but the eyes themselves were kind. She did not ask Asha for her history or her destination. She saw the exhaustion in the young woman's face and the fine, expensive coat that was so clearly not her own. She saw a soul in need of a safe harbor. "Room's $5 a week, Mrs." Gable said, her voice soft but practical. "Payable in advance. Supper is at 6. Asha paid with coins she had kept tied in a handkerchief deep within her trunk. "Mrs." Gable led her up a narrow, creaking staircase to a small, clean room under the eaves. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a single wooden peg on the wall. It was more than enough. From across the street, half hidden in the alleyway between the saloon and the livery, Eben watched her disappear into the boarding house. He sat his horse, the cold seeping into him now without the protection of his coat, and did not move. He should have ridden away. His chores at the ranch were waiting, but he could not bring himself to leave. He was not watching to possess or to intrude, but because of a feeling he could not name, a reluctant sense of responsibility that kept him tethered to the spot. He waited until he saw a lamp lit in the upstairs window before he finally turned his horse and rode out of town, the memory of her frightened eyes following him into the darkening plains. The days that followed fell into a quiet, hard rhythm. Local tensions, which had been simmering for months, began to bubble closer to the surface. A large plantation of settlers to the east, led by a man named Caldwell, was pushing its boundaries, claiming grazing land that had long been shared. The Big Cross Creek Ranch, which employed half the men in town, including Eben, was coveting the water rights to the only river that ran reliably through the dry season. Whispers went around the saloon about men forming a vigilante group. Regulators, they called themselves, to protect their interests against outsiders and troublemakers. The definition of an outsider, Asha knew, was dangerously fluid. In her small room, as the autumn light faded, Asha would sit by the window, listening to the wind and the distant, lonely sounds of the town. Her trunk sat at the foot of her bed, a solid anchor to a life that had been washed away. On the peg beside it hung the cowboy's coat. It was a foreign object in the sparse room, dark and heavy, and smelling of a world she did not know. Some nights, she could not stop the memories from coming. They came in flashes, unbidden and sharp. The scent of pine smoke from her family's cook fire, the sound of her mother's laugh. Then, the other smells, the other sounds. Gunpowder, the screams, the splintering of their lodgepole home, the feel of rough hands tearing at her clothes. It was that memory, the memory of violation, that had taught her to build walls around herself, to ask for boundaries with a voice that shook but did not break. And across town, in his cold bunkhouse, Eben wrestled with his own ghosts. He would lie awake, staring into the darkness, and see the silver flash of the moon on a raging river. He would feel the desperate, slipping grip of a young boy's hand, a homesteader's son caught in the flash flood. He had tried. God, he had tried. But the current was too strong, his body too cold, and the boy had been torn from his grasp. He had watched the small shape disappear into the black water, and a part of him had gone with it. He had failed, and that failure had become the silent, defining fact of his life. One evening, after a long day of mending Mrs. Gable's linens until her fingers were raw, Asha stood before the window, the cowboy's coat hung on its peg, a silent sentinel. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingertips barely brushing against the soft, worn wool of the collar. A complicated ache bloomed in her chest. It was an ache of gratitude and shame, of fear and a flicker of something she could not name. The coat was protection. It was a kindness. But it was also a reminder that she was here, alone. A reminder that any safety she might find in this land was conditional, a gift that could be taken away as easily as it had been given. Life in Redemption settled into a routine of toil, the days measured by the rising and setting of a sun that offered little warmth. Asha found work where she could, her life becoming a patchwork of small labors. For Mrs. Gable, she cooked and cleaned, her hands perpetually chapped from lye soap and scalding water. For the blacksmith's wife, she took in mending, her fingers growing nimble and calloused from pushing a needle through thick canvas and rough wool. The dust of the town was a constant presence, a fine, gritty powder that worked its way through the very weave of her dresses, that settled in the back of her throat and lined the sills of her small window. In the afternoons, when the light grew thin and slanted, she would sit by that window and work on her beadwork. She had brought the materials with her, a small, precious hoard of colored glass beads, sinew, and treated hide. With painstaking patience, she created intricate patterns, geometric designs that told stories without words, echoes of the life she had lost. She sold these pieces, small pouches, decorative strips, a pair of moccasins, at a small table she set up on the edge of the weekly market. Some people stopped to look, their curiosity warring with their suspicion. Most walked by without a glance. Each night, she would climb the stairs to her room, the muscles in her back and shoulders screaming in protest, her hands a dull, throbbing ache that sleep could not quite erase. Eben's life was a different kind of toil, but just as relentless. His days were spent in the saddle, riding the vast, lonely stretches of the Cross Creek Ranch. He mended fences that the wind and the cattle had broken, his hands working with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew his tools. He doctored sick calves, his touch surprisingly gentle, his voice a low, calming murmur. He worked late into the evenings, often alone, the light of his lantern a tiny, defiant spark against the immense, star-dusted darkness of the prairie. His neighbors and fellow ranch hands greeted him with clipped nods and spare words. They were men who measured each other by the quality of their work and the length of their silence. A man's past was his own business, but his debts, whether of money or of honor, were matters of public record. Eben kept his accounts clean and his thoughts to himself. They kept crossing paths in town, these two solitary figures. The encounters were brief and charged, like the static in the air before a storm. Once, as Asha stood before the baker's counter, counting out her few coins, she came up a penny short for a loaf of bread. A flush of shame crept up her neck. Before she could speak, a hand reached past her shoulder and dropped 2 pennies on the counter. It was Eben. He did not look at her. He simply nodded to the baker, took his own purchase, and walked out. Asha stood for a moment, the warm loaf in her hands, her heart hammering. When she saw him on the street later, she met his gaze and gave him a curt, sharp nod. It was all the thanks she could offer, a gesture that was both an acknowledgement and a wall, a thing that protected her pride and, she knew, wounded his. The quiet hostility of the town was beginning to find its voice. The rumors that had swirled around her arrival were hardening into something uglier, something with conviction. One afternoon, she went to Mr. Sterling's Mercantile to buy a length of dark wool fabric to fashion a warmer dress. He stood behind his counter, polishing a pair of spectacles, and did not look up as she entered. She laid the bolt of cloth on the counter and waited. "I ain't selling to you," he said, his voice flat and final. Asha stared at him. "I have the money." "It ain't about the money," he said, finally looking at her, his eyes as cold and gray as river stones. "It's about what's proper. We're a decent town here." She felt the blood drain from her face, but she held his gaze. She said nothing. She simply turned and walked out, the little bell above the door tinkling mockingly behind her. After that, she noticed the mothers who would steer their children to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. She heard the whispers that followed her like a trail of dry, rustling leaves. The new preacher, a thin, fervent man with a voice like a whip, took to delivering sermons about the dangers of outside ways and the impurities that could poison a God-fearing community. He never mentioned her by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. The malice found its champion in a young man named Jed Stone. He worked a small, failing plot of land a few miles out of town and carried a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. He saw in Asha a target for the sour mash of his own disappointments. He found her at her market table one blustery afternoon, a small group of his friends loitering behind him for support. "Well now, look what we got here," Jed said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He picked up one of her beaded pouches, his grimy fingers smudging the delicate work. "Selling your little trinkets, are you?" He mimicked her way of speaking, exaggerating the soft cadence of her voice in a cruel mockery. "How much for this little bag? Enough to buy your way into a white man's town?" Asha's face became a stony mask. "It is not for you," she said, her voice low and steady. "Oh, it ain't for me?" he sneered, tossing the pouch back onto her table. "Too good for my money. Is that it?" "Put your hands off her things. Jed." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the afternoon air like a blade. Eben stood a few feet away, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. He had been on his way to the livery, but had stopped when he heard Jed's loud talk. Jed turned, a smirk on his face. "Well, if it ain't Eben, come to protect the local stray." "I said, leave her be," Eben repeated, his voice unchanged. He took a step forward. He was not a large man, but he had a stillness about him, a coiled intensity that promised violence without having to shout. Jed looked from Eben's cold eyes to his friends, who were suddenly finding interesting things to look at in the dust. His bravado faltered. "Just having a bit of fun," he muttered. He spat on the ground near Asha's feet, a final gesture of contempt, and sauntered off with his cronies. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Asha began packing her things, her hands shaking with a silent, contained fury. "Are you all right?" Eben asked, his voice rough. She did not look at him. "I can fend for myself," she said, the words clipped and sharp. She hated this. She hated being the center of a spectacle, a helpless creature to be defended. To be seen as weak was to be seen as a victim, and she would not be a victim again. Eben felt her words like a physical blow. He heard the insult to his pride, the rejection of his help. He had acted on pure instinct, a protective urge that was so strong it almost frightened him. And for his trouble, he got this cold dismissal. A hot, possessive anger flickered in his gut. He wanted to grab her arm, to shake her, to make her see that he was only trying to help. But he caught himself, the memory of her fear on the train platform rising up to check him. He clenched his jaw, turned on his heel without another word, and stalked away. The conflict did not end there. Jed, humiliated in public, let his resentment fester. A few nights later, as Asha was walking back to the boarding house from the blacksmith's, he stepped out of a dark alleyway. He did not speak. He just shoved her, hard. She stumbled, catching herself against the rough wall of a building, scraping her arm. He laughed, a short, ugly sound, and disappeared back into the darkness. She stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding, the laughter echoing in her ears. It was not the shove that scared her. It was the ease of it, the casual, unaccountable cruelty. A few days later, a package appeared on the doorstep of the boarding house. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Mrs. Gable brought it to Asha's room. Inside was Eben's sheepskin coat. It was cleaner than she had ever seen it, the wool soft and smelling faintly of soap and wood smoke. Tucked in the pocket was a small, heavy loaf of rye bread, and with it, a piece of folded paper. She opened it. The handwriting was a rough, blocky scrawl. Figured you might still need it. That was all. No name, no apology, no explanation. An ache spread through Asha's chest, a painful, tender thing. She ran her hand over the clean wool, the warmth of the gesture a stark contrast to the coldness of the world outside her window. She took the note and, after a moment's hesitation, she carefully tucked it deep inside the coat's lining, a secret she would keep hidden, a small flame she would not let anyone see. The seasons were turning, a cold, wet autumn bleeding into the promise of a hard winter. Sickness came with the cold. On a neighboring farm, the Miller family's youngest son, a small, bright boy named Thomas, fell ill with a fever that would not break. His breathing grew ragged, his skin hot to the touch. The town's doctor was 2 counties away, making a slow circuit, not expected back for months. Mrs. Miller was frantic with worry. Word of the boy's illness reached the boarding house. Mrs. Gable spoke of it at supper, her face creased with concern. Asha listened, saying nothing. But the next morning, she took a small cloth bag and walked the 2 miles to the Miller farm. She found Mrs. Miller sitting by her son's bedside, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. Asha did not offer pleasantries. "I may be able to help," she said quietly. Mrs. Miller looked at her, her eyes full of a desperate hope that outweighed her prejudice. She nodded. Asha went to work. She sent Mr. Miller out to gather willow bark from the creek bed and yarrow from the edge of the fields. From her own bag, she produced dried roots and leaves she had gathered and preserved herself. She brewed a bitter tea, forcing spoonfuls of it between the boy's cracked lips. She crushed leaves into a poultice, mixing it with lard, and spread it on his chest. For 2 days and 2 nights, she sat with him, bathing his head with cool water, speaking to him in the soft, melodic tones of the Comanche tongue. Mrs. Miller watched, silent and awestruck. She was witnessing a knowledge that was ancient and powerful, a form of care she had never imagined. On the morning of the 3rd day, the boy's fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear for the first time in a week, and asked for a drink of water. Mrs. Miller wept with gratitude. Clutching Asha's hands, she tried to pay her, but Asha refused. The story of what she had done spread through the town. For some, it was a miracle, a reason to reconsider their harsh judgments. Mrs. Miller became Asha's fiercest defender, but for others, her knowledge was just another form of strangeness, something to be feared. The preacher spoke of heathen remedies and dark arts. The prejudice remained, stubborn as a winter weed. The fragile peace was shattered a week later. It was late, a wild wind rattling the windows of the boarding house. A frantic, desperate knock echoed through the house. Mrs. Gable, a wrapper clutched around her, hurried to open it. Her younger son, Daniel, stood on the porch, his face ashen, his breath coming in ragged sobs. "It's Silas," he choked out, his voice breaking. "Ma, it's Silas. He's been killed." Asha, woken by the noise, stood at the top of the stairs, her hand on the railing. They found him behind the saloon. Daniel wept. "A fight. They said it was a fight. But his pockets were full. It wasn't a robbery. It was those men, Ma, the masked ones, the ones who said they were cleaning up the town." A cold dread, sharper and more final than any she had ever known, settled over the house. The whispers in the saloons, the talk of vigilantes and troublemakers, had just become a matter of life and death. Fear, cold and immediate, spread through the night like wildfire. The death of Silas Gable laid a shroud over the town of Redemption. A heavy, watchful silence settled in the streets, punctuated by the sharp slam of a door or the rattle of a wagon moving too fast. Shutters were closed on windows that were usually left open to the pale autumn sun. Funerals in a town this small were meant to be communal affairs, a collective shouldering of grief. But Silas's was a clipped, sparsely attended service held under a sky the color of lead. Only a handful of people stood beside Mrs. Gable and her younger son, Daniel, the blacksmith, the Millers, a few quiet women from the church. The rest of the town stayed away, their absence a verdict in itself. Men gathered in tight knots on the corners of the street, in the shadowed interior of the saloon, their voices low and urgent. They spoke of keeping order, of the need for strong hands now that the law had proven weak. The words were righteous, but the feeling behind them was something else, a feverish mix of fear and opportunity. The unspoken truth was that Silas Gable's death was not a tragedy to them. It was a justification. It did not take long for the whispers to take shape. A posse was formed, though they called themselves the town regulators. Jed Stone was one of the first to join, his face flushed with a newfound sense of importance. He and a dozen other men were deputized not by the sheriff, but by their own consensus. They were given leave to patrol the town and its outskirts at night, to question strangers, to enforce a peace of their own making. One evening, the foreman from the Cross Creek Ranch, a hard, sun-cracked man named Miller, approached Eben as he was cleaning his tack. "We're riding tonight, Eben," Miller said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Just a patrol. Let folks know we're watching." Eben kept his eyes on the bridle in his hands, his fingers working oil into the stiff leather. "That's the sheriff's job." "The sheriff's job is to not upset Mr. Sterling at the Mercantile," Miller scoffed. "This is our town. We have to protect it." He paused, his voice lowering. "Folks are talking, wondering where you stand. You've been here a long time. You're one of us." The words, "one of us," hung in the air. It was a thing Eben had not felt for years, not since the river. The need to belong, to be part of something solid, was a powerful current, and he felt it pulling at him. It would be so easy to say yes, to saddle his horse and be absorbed back into the fold, his solitude forgotten. But he thought of Asha's face on the train platform. He thought of the slur Jet had spat in the dust, and he thought of Silas Gable, lying in the cold ground. "My work is here," Eben said, his voice quiet but firm. He finally looked up, meeting the foreman's hard gaze. "I've got fences to mend." Miller stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Have it your way," he said, and walked away. Eben was alone again, but he knew he had just drawn a line, and now he was on the other side of it. In the quiet, grief-stricken rooms of the boarding house, Asha learned more about the man who had been murdered, Mrs. Gable, in moments of unguarded sorrow, would speak of her older son. Silas had not been a saint. She admitted he had a taste for cards and had fallen into debt. He sometimes took freight jobs with rough men who lived on the fringes of the town's approval, but he had been kind. He had fixed the loose board on the porch without being asked. He had a gentle way with frightened animals. He had once given his own dinner to a starving family passing through town. "They act as if he deserved it," Mrs. Gable whispered one evening, her hands twisting a dishcloth in her lap. "Because he wasn't like them. Because he drank with freighters and didn't bow and scrape to the ranchers. They mourn the idea of lawlessness, but they don't mourn my son." Asha listened, a cold knot forming in her stomach. She understood. She had seen it her whole life. The world was divided into people who mattered and people who did not. The line between the two was arbitrary and brutal. Safety was not a right. It was a privilege, granted only to those who stayed on the correct side of the line. And Silas, by being in debt, by being friends with the wrong people, had crossed it, just as she had, simply by being born. A few days after the funeral, a small, informal memorial was held at the gravesite. It was little more than a gathering of the few who had cared for Silas. Asha went, drawn by a sense of solidarity with the grieving mother. She stood near an old, wind-stunted cedar tree, separate from the small cluster of mourners, as Mrs. Gable placed a small bunch of dried prairie flowers on the fresh mound of earth. A figure approached from the other side of the cemetery. It was Eben. He stopped a dozen paces from her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He had not come for the community of mourners. He had come, like her, to stand as a solitary witness. They were close enough to touch, but a vast gulf of silence and caution lay between them. They were two separate islands of grief in the same sad sea. When the others began to drift away, their quiet condolences offered. Asha remained. She stepped forward to the grave, in the quiet of the dying afternoon. She began to speak, her voice low and clear. She spoke the names of her mother, her father, her brother, lost to a fire and a fury she could never forget. And then she spoke Silas's name. She spoke them all in the Komanche tongue, the words a soft, flowing river of sound, a lament that the wind carried away across the plains. It was an act of remembrance for all the lost, for all the people whose deaths were not mourned by the men in power. Eben listened, and something inside him broke open. He did not understand the words, but he understood the sound of loss. He understood the profound injustice of a world that could erase a person so completely. As her voice washed over him, a memory he kept buried under years of hard work and harder silence clawed its way to the surface. He was 20 years old again, working for a powerful cattle baron determined to clear his new range of nesters. They had come to a small, dusty homestead, a family of sodbusters who had the misfortune of building their house on a patch of land the baron wanted. It was a forced eviction. Eben had sat on his horse, his rifle across his lap, and watched as the family's meager possessions were thrown out into the dirt. The father, a man with desperation in his eyes, had refused to leave. He stood in his doorway, holding a broken shovel, and said this land was his. The baron's foreman had laughed. 3 men had pulled the homesteader out into the yard and beaten him while his wife and children screamed. They beat him until he stopped moving. Eben had watched it all. He had held his rifle, felt its cold, heavy weight, and done nothing. He was just a boy then, afraid of the foreman, afraid of losing his pay, but that fear had curdled into a self-loathing that had shaped the rest of his life. He had closed off his heart that day, vowing to never again feel the agony of his own cowardice, offering the coat to Asha, paying for her bread. They were not acts of heroism. They were small, pathetic attempts to pay back a debt to a ghost. His memory was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats and shouting from the direction of town. A reddish-orange glow was beginning to stain the dark underbelly of the clouds to the west. Fire. The regulators, full of whiskey and self-importance, had found their first real target. A small caravan of itinerant traders had made camp for the night by the creek. The posse, deciding they were thieves, descended on the camp with torches in righteous fury. Asha saw the flames, and a primal, sickening terror seized her. The light danced and flickered, and for a horrifying instant, it was not a trader's wagon burning, but her own family's lodge. The memory was so vivid she could smell the burning hide, hear the screams, but this time, something else rose up alongside the fear, a fierce, defiant anger. She would not stand by and watch it happen again. She began to run toward the fire. "Asha, no!" Eben's voice was sharp, but she didn't hear it. She reached the edge of the chaos. Men were yelling, dragging people from their wagons. A woman was on her knees, trying to shield a small child. Asha ran toward them, her only thought to help. She grabbed the arm of one of the regulators, a man she recognized from the saloon. "Stop it! They have done nothing!" The man, his face slick with sweat and rage, turned on her. His eyes were wild. "Get your hands off me, you—" He spat a foul word at her, a slur that cut deeper than any blade, and shoved her to the ground. He raised his boot to kick her when a body slammed into him, throwing him sideways. It was Eben. He pulled Asha to her feet, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get out of here, now!" he yelled at her. Someone swung a burning torch at him. He threw up an arm to block it, the flames searing his sleeve and his skin. He grunted in pain but did not let go of Asha, pulling her away from the melee, back into the darkness. Jed Stone and 2 others started toward them, but the ranch foreman, Miller, stepped in their way. "That's enough," he growled. "He's one of ours." The words, meant to protect Eben, only highlighted how completely Asha was not. The next morning, his arm wrapped in a crude bandage, Eben walked into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a heavy man whose uniform was always a size too small. He was cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. "There was a raid last night. Sheriff," Eben said, his voice tight. "The regulators burned out a family of traders. They nearly beat a woman to death." Sheriff Brody sighed, not looking up from his task. "I heard there was a scuffle. Eben, some drunks got out of hand. The traders have already moved on. No harm, no foul." "No harm?" Eben's voice rose. "They called it justice. They attacked Asha. They could have killed her." Now the sheriff looked up, his eyes weary. "Listen to me. Son, this town runs on a delicate balance. The ranchers and the merchants, they pay the bills. They want to feel secure. These regulators are just letting off steam. You stir this pot, and it's going to boil over on everyone. My advice? You and that Komanche woman keep your heads down. The world is what it is. You can't change it." Asha, who had followed Eben and stood listening in the doorway, spoke up, her voice trembling with rage. "Is that what the law is? A balance of business? A man is dead. A family is gone. Where is the justice?" The sheriff gave her a look of tired pity. "Justice is a luxury we can't afford right now. Miss, the best you can hope for is to be left alone." The regulators, emboldened by the sheriff's inaction, grew bolder. The tension in town reached its breaking point 2 nights later. A crash of breaking glass woke the boarding house. "Mrs." Gable cried out. When they lit a lamp, they found the 2 front windows of the parlor shattered, and scrawled across the front door in thick, white paint was a single, ugly word. A vile slur aimed directly at Asha. Eben saw it the next morning. He stood on the street, looking at the broken windows and the hateful word on the door, and something inside him snapped. The careful walls he had built around his heart, the years of quiet shame and inaction, crumbled to dust. He would not stand by again. He would not be the boy who watched and did nothing. He found Asha in Mrs. Gable's backyard, sweeping up the shards of broken glass. Her movements were stiff, her face pale but resolute. "I'm going to teach you how to be safe here," he said, his voice raw. "How to use a gun. You won't walk anywhere alone. I'll see to it." Asha stopped sweeping. She turned to him slowly, her eyes flashing with a fire he had not expected. His words, meant to be a vow of protection, sounded to her like a claim of ownership. They sounded like every man who had ever tried to control her, to put her in a cage, whether for her own good or for his own purpose. "No," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You will not." "This isn't a request," he said, his frustration and fear making him reckless. "You saw what they did. You need protecting." "I need to be left to make my own way. I am not a horse to be broken or a parcel to be guarded." She took a step toward him, her chin high. "I will not be owned." Her words struck him like a physical blow, a rejection of the very core of his new resolve. "You are being stubborn to the point of foolishness," he shot back, his voice rising. "Your pride will get you killed." "And your protection is a leash," she retorted, her voice cracking with the force of her emotion. "Is that what you want, Eben? To feel like a big man saving the poor Indian girl? Does that soothe the ghosts you carry around?" The question was so sharp, so close to the bone of his secret shame, that he flinched. He said the first cruel thing he could think of. "Maybe the sheriff is right. Maybe you should have just kept your head down." The hurt in her eyes was immediate and deep. She said nothing else. She simply turned her back on him and went back to sweeping the broken glass. The space between them was suddenly a chasm, full of the jagged, wounding things they had just said to each other. He stood there for another moment, then turned and walked away, the conflict unresolved. That night, Eben lay on his thin mattress in the bunkhouse, his burned arm throbbing. He stared into the oppressive darkness, the sounds of the other men's sleeping breaths grating on his nerves. He was not thinking of the fight. He was not thinking of the angry words. He was thinking of a cold morning on a train platform and the impossible weight of a sheepskin coat. He remembered the feel of it in his hands as he had offered it, an act of simple, uncomplicated kindness, and he was haunted by the sting of his own words that had taken that simple gesture and twisted it into something ugly, something that felt like a cage. The quarrel left an ugly silence in its wake, a space filled with the jagged edges of things said and unsaid. The next morning, before the sun had risen, Asha was gone. She left a note for Mrs. Gable, a simple message of thanks and a promise to return, with her week's rent carefully folded inside the paper. She took nothing but a small bundle of food, the clothes on her back, and the knowledge of the trails her people had walked for generations. She walked west, away from the raw wound of the town, toward the solace of the familiar. For 3 days, she walked. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but it was a language she understood. She knew which roots held water, which berries were safe to eat, and how to read the clouds for signs of a coming storm. The physical act of walking, of putting one foot in front of the other, began to scour the anger and fear from her soul, leaving behind a hard, clean grief. She found the small Komanche camp tucked into a shallow, wind-swept canyon, their lodges blending so perfectly with the tawny landscape that a stranger would have ridden right past them. It was a small band, a remnant of a once great nation, moving quietly across a land that was no longer theirs. They took her in without question. Here, she was not an outsider. She was simply one of them. She spent her days with an elder woman whose name meant "she who remembers." They scraped hides, their hands moving in an ancient, synchronized rhythm. They spoke of the old ways, of the stories carried in the stars, and of the strategies for survival that were now more critical than ever. "To be strong is not to be unbending," the old woman told her, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The willow survives the storm because it bends. The oak breaks. But you must never forget the shape of your own trunk. You must know who you are when the wind stops blowing." Asha listened, and she felt the frayed edges of her spirit begin to knit back together. She performed the rituals of her family, offering prayers to the spirits of the land and the sky, remembering the faces of her lost kin not with the hot agony of fresh grief, but with a quiet, enduring love. She was mending herself, gathering the strength she would need to return to the world of men who stood like oaks, rigid and ready to break, back in redemption. Eben was adrift in a sea of guilt and anger. He threw himself into his work, seeking exhaustion as a cure for thought. He rode the farthest fence lines, worked through meals, and took on the hardest, most thankless chores, punishing his body for the failings of his tongue. He tried to make small, unspoken amends. He saw that the Miller family's woodpile was low and spent an afternoon chopping and stacking a cord of firewood, leaving it neatly by their back door without a word. He mended a broken gate for another small homesteader. They were small, anonymous acts of contrition that did little to ease the hollow ache in his chest. One evening, he returned to the bunkhouse, bone-weary and covered in dust, to find a folded piece of paper on his cot. It was from Mrs. Gable. Her handwriting was neat and clear, the letters formed with a sad precision. He unfolded it. The note contained only 7 words. "We're tired of men who stand still." The simple, cutting truth of it struck him harder than any fist. He sat on the edge of his cot, the letter in his hand, and felt the full weight of his own inertia. He had stood still his whole life, on the riverbank as a boy was swept away, in the yard as a homesteader was beaten, and here, in this town, as a good woman was terrorized. Word came a few days later. carried by a circuit rider. The regulators had paid a visit to a family of German immigrants who had homesteaded a few miles north. They had accused the family of stealing cattle, terrorized them through the night, and finally driven them from their land with a warning to never return. In their panicked flight into the teeth of an early winter storm, their youngest child had gotten lost. They had found the small body 2 days later, frozen in a shallow ravine. The news fell like a stone into the already poisoned well of the town's mood. Fear was now a palpable thing, a cold fog that clung to the streets. The regulators, far from being condemned, grew bolder. They had driven away outsiders. They had protected the town's interests. In the eyes of many, they were heroes. Asha returned the next day, walking into a town that was colder and more divided than the one she had left. Her face was calm, her back straight. The resilience she had found in the wilderness was a quiet armor around her. She saw the new fear in people's eyes and the new swagger in the walk of men like Jed Stone. She knew that something had to break. The breaking point came at a public hearing about land and water rights held in the town's new, half-finished meeting hall. The room was packed with ranchers, farmers, and merchants, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and simmering resentment. Caldwell, the plantation owner, was making a legal claim to the creek that bordered the Cross Creek Ranch. The dispute was threatening to tear the community apart. Asha was there, standing quietly at the back of the room with Mrs. Gable. She had a right to be there. The boarding house drew its water from a well that was fed by the same aquifer, but her presence was a spark in a room full of gunpowder. Mr. Sterling, the merchant, stood up to speak. "This isn't just about water," he said, his voice ringing with self-righteousness. "It's about the character of this town. It's about who belongs here. We are building a community of decent, hard-working families. We cannot allow our property values, our very way of life, to be threatened by elements that don't share our traditions." He did not look at Asha, but every person in the room felt the pull of his gaze toward the back wall. A murmur went through the crowd. Jed Stone, standing with the other regulators, called out, "He's right! We don't want their kind here!" Before anyone else could speak, Eben stepped forward from the side of the room. He was clean-shaven, his hair combed, but there was a dangerous light in his eyes. "Her name is Asha," he said, his voice not loud but carrying to every corner of the room. "And she has more right to be here than any of us. She was born of this land. We are the outsiders." Sterling sneered. "Are you her champion now, Eben? We all know you have a soft spot for strays, but this is business, not charity." "It's about what's right," Eben said, his voice tight. "And you, Sterling, wouldn't know what's right if it bit you. You talk about traditions, but the only tradition you honor is the one that fills your pockets. You and Caldwell and the rest of you would see this whole county burn if it meant an extra $1 for you." He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over his neighbors, the men he worked with every day. "You let men like this speak for you, and you'll lose more than just your water. You'll lose your souls." "Those are big words from a man who works for the company," Caldwell called out, a smug look on his face. "As I recall, you weren't so concerned about what was right a few years back. You were happy enough to sign the papers when we needed you to." Asha, watching from the back, felt a sudden, cold premonition. Eben's face went pale. He looked from Caldwell's triumphant face to the curious faces of the crowd, and then his eyes found Asha's. In that moment, he knew he had to tell the truth. It was the only thing he had left to give. "He's right," Eben said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it seemed to fill the suddenly silent room. "A few years ago, working for another company, I was asked to witness a document, a legal claim. It transferred the title of a piece of land from a Komanche family to the company. I was told it was just a formality. I didn't ask questions. I was young, and I needed the pay. I signed it." The revelation was catastrophic. The air went out of the room. To the townspeople, it was a minor hypocrisy, a bit of old business, but to Asha, it was a betrayal of an entirely different magnitude. It was not abstract, it was personal. He had been a part of the slow, legal, relentless machine that had stripped her people of everything. He was not just a man who had stood still. He was a man who had held the pen. She moved through the crowd, which parted for her as if she were a ghost. She walked right up to him, her face a mask of disbelief and a pain so deep it was terrifying to behold. Her hands came up, not as fists to fight, but as hard, desperate knots of pain, and she struck his chest once, twice. They were not hard blows, but they were laden with the weight of a generation of loss. "You," she whispered, the word full of shattered trust. She turned and fled from the hall, leaving Eben standing alone in the middle of the room. The whispers rising around him like a tide. He did not feel the sting on his chest. He was broken, not by her touch, but by the unbearable weight of a truth he could not undo, a past he could not fix. The public confrontation lit a fuse. The regulators, feeling their authority challenged and their prejudices validated, escalated from intimidation to outright violence. A few days later, a wagon carrying 2 Komanche families, distant relatives of the band Asha had visited, was passing through the county on their way to a government reservation. The regulators, led by Jed Stone, intercepted them on the road. They called it an inspection for stolen goods. It quickly turned into an attack. Shots were fired. A man named Blackhawk, whom Asha had spoken with in the canyon camp, was killed as he tried to shield a small child from the gunfire. The families were robbed, their wagon overturned, and they were left on the open prairie, a stark warning to any other outsiders who might dare to cross the regulators' path. The town stood divided. Some were horrified by the murder, while others, like Sterling, quietly defended it as a necessary evil. The line had been drawn in blood. Eben, shattered by his public confession and Asha's reaction, found a new, terrible clarity. He had spent his life trying to outrun his past. Now, he would turn and face it. He gathered a small group of men, the blacksmith, young Daniel Gable, and a few ranch hands who were disgusted by the violence, in the back of the livery stable. "We have to expose them," Eben said, his voice raw. "We have to show the whole town who the regulators really are, not peacekeepers, but murderers." It was a dangerous proposition. It would mean risking their reputations, their livelihoods, and quite possibly their lives. But they all agreed. That night, he went to the boarding house. The front windows were still boarded up. He knocked on the back door. After a long moment, Asha opened it. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes full of a weary sorrow. "I am not here to ask for your forgiveness," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "I don't deserve it, but I need you to know. I am going to stop them. Not for you, not for me, for the man they killed, for his family." She looked at him, her gaze searching his face, looking for the truth. For the first time, they began to speak honestly, without the barriers of pride or fear. He did not make excuses for his past. He simply laid it bare. She did not offer absolution. She told him about the family that had been attacked, about the man she had known, about the child who was now fatherless. "If you do this," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "they will come for you. They will come for anyone who helps you." "I know," he said. "I need to know whose side you are on," she said. "Not for my sake, for theirs." "I'm on the side of what's right," he answered. Finally. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a promise of a future. It was a raw, honest negotiation of an alliance, a shared purpose forged in the crucible of violence and betrayal. The emotional intimacy between them deepened, a bond of truth that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with a shared, desperate need for justice. They did not know that they were being watched. A figure detached itself from the shadows across the street and disappeared into the night. The regulators' response was swift and brutal. They did not come for Eben directly. They came for the heart of the small resistance that was forming against them. They came for the woman who had sheltered the outsider, the mother whose son they had already killed. In the dead of night, while the town slept, they rode to the boarding house, their faces covered by masks, their hands holding torches. Asha was woken by the smell of smoke, thick and acrid. A terrifying orange light flickered against her window. She threw open her door to a wall of heat and smoke. The downstairs was already an inferno. She screamed Mrs. Gable's name. A faint cry came from the end of the hall. Eben, sleeping fitfully in the bunkhouse, heard the fire bell begin to clang its frantic, desperate alarm. He was outside in an instant, pulling on his boots, his heart seizing with a terrible, certain dread. He ran, faster than he had ever run in his life, toward the pillar of fire and smoke that was consuming the end of the street. He reached the burning house to see a crowd gathering, their faces lit with a horrified, helpless glow. Asha was on the ground, coughing, her face black with soot, being held back by the blacksmith. "She's still in there!" Asha screamed, struggling against him. "Mrs. Gable!" Without a second thought, Eben soaked a horse blanket in the water trough, wrapped it around his head, and plunged into the burning building. He found Mrs. Gable in the upstairs hallway, overcome by smoke, a fallen beam pinning her legs. He managed to free her, to drag her through the suffocating heat and collapsing structure, out into the night air just as the roof caved in with a deafening roar. But it was too late. Her lungs were seared, her body burned. She died on the street, her head in Asha's lap, her last breath a soft, painful sigh. The emotional stakes were now all in the open. The quiet boarding house, a fragile sanctuary of kindness, was a roaring pyre. The last buffer against the town's cruelty was gone. Eben and Asha stood in the terrible, flickering light of the flames. Their personal quarrel burned away, their shared loss transformed into a singular, unyielding need for justice. The fire that consumed the boarding house also burned away the town's pretense of unity. In the gray light of morning, redemption was fractured. The smoldering ruin at the end of the street was a line drawn in ash, and every citizen had to choose which side they were on. Some, like the millers and the blacksmith, rallied with a quiet, grim determination for law and order. They saw Sarah Gable's death for what it was, a murder born of hatred, an attack on the very idea of decency. But others doubled down on their prejudice, their fear twisting into a dark, defensive anger. They whispered that the widow had brought it on herself by sheltering an outsider, that the fire was a tragic but necessary consequence of stirring up trouble. The real powers in the town, the railroad company, the Ranchers Association, and merchants like Mr. Sterling weighed in not with words, but with a cold, calculated silence. An open conflict was bad for business. A swift, quiet return to the established order was paramount. They saw the regulators not as a menace, but as a tool, a blunt instrument for maintaining a status quo that favored their profits over human lives. In the smoky, clangorous space of the blacksmith's forge, which had become their temporary refuge, Eben and Asha made their decision. Asha's worldly possessions now consisted of a single trunk, miraculously saved from the flames by the blacksmith, and the clothes on her back. Eben had a burned arm, a collection of bruises, and a reputation that was now as ruined as the boarding house. They had nothing left to lose. "The sheriff will do nothing," Asha said, her voice raspy from smoke and grief. She was stitching a tear in Daniel Gable's shirt, her hands moving with a steady, automatic rhythm. "The men with money will protect their own. There is no justice here." "Then we go over their heads," Eben said. He was looking at a map of the county, his finger tracing the route of the circuit court. "Judge Morrison is due in the county seat in 2 weeks. He's a hard man, but they say he's an honest one. If we can bring him a case, a real case with evidence and witnesses, he has to listen." It was a fool's errand, a long and difficult ledger of legal and social maneuvering. It meant confronting a town that had already chosen its sides. It meant finding people brave enough to speak out against men who had already proven they were willing to kill. They started with Daniel Gable. The boy, hollowed out by the loss of his mother and brother, told them everything he knew about the men who had threatened his family. The blacksmith, a stoic man named Peterson, agreed to testify about the threats he'd heard in his shop. Slowly, painfully, they began to build their case, a fragile structure of truth in a town built on lies. The process was a gauntlet of quiet threats and cold shoulders. When Eben went to the Cross Creek Ranch to collect his pay, the foreman, Miller, handed him his wages along with a warning. "You're making a mistake, Eben. These men you're going against, they have long memories. You're throwing your life away for nothing." Eben simply took his money and left. The job he'd held for 10 years gone without another word. Bribes were offered. An anonymous envelope of cash left for Daniel. A lucrative contract offered to the blacksmith by one of Sterling's associates, which was promptly refused. Fear was a constant companion. The hearing was held in the unfinished meeting hall, the same room where Eben had made his catastrophic confession. It was repurposed as a makeshift courtroom, with the judge's bench a rough plank table and the public seated on splintery benches. The air was thick with tension. On one side sat the regulators, a smug, confident block of men led by Jed Stone, with a slick, expensive-looking lawyer named Davies representing them. On the other side sat Eben, Asha, Daniel, the blacksmith, and the Millers, a small, isolated island of defiance. The hearing was a brutal, systematic dismantling of the truth. Sheriff Brody testified that the fire was a tragic accident, its cause unknown. Mr. Sterling testified to the good character of the accused, calling them concerned citizens. But the central set piece, the moment the entire proceeding turned on, was Asha's testimony. When her name was called, a hostile murmur rippled through the room. She walked to the front, her back straight, her head held high. She wore a simple dark dress Mrs. Miller had given her. She looked small and terribly alone. She told her story in a measured voice, a voice that did not tremble. She spoke of the threats, of the vandalism, of the escalating violence. She spoke of Sarah Gable's kindness and of her murder. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply presented the facts, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the ugliness of the events she described. The quiet power of her truth settled over the room, and for a moment, even the scoffers were silent. Then came the cross-examination. The lawyer, Davies, rose, a thin, predatory smile on his lips. He did not question her facts. He questioned her. "Miss," he began, letting the unspoken name hang in the air with contempt. "You are not from Redemption, are you?" "No," Asha said. "And you have no family here, no ties to this community?" "I had a friend," she said, her voice quiet. "Sarah Gable." "Ah, yes, the woman whose house you were living in. A house that, by a remarkable coincidence, burned to the ground shortly after your arrival. Tell me, what is your relationship with Mr. Eben, who also seems to have taken a keen interest in your welfare?" The insinuation was clear and foul. Asha felt a hot flush of shame, but her voice remained steady. "He is a man who believes in what is right. Or is he a man who was taken in by a pretty face and a sad story?" Davies pressed, his voice dripping with scorn. "Is it not true that you have caused nothing but trouble since you arrived in this town? Disputes at the market, public altercations. Is it not possible that this fire, this tragic accident, was the result of a conflict you yourself created?" He twisted her every action, her every word, into an indictment of her character. He painted her as a provocateur, a dangerous element, the source of the town's troubles, not the victim of them. It was a humiliating, soul-stripping ordeal, and she could feel the weight of the crowd's opinion shifting, the seeds of doubt he was planting taking root in the fertile ground of their prejudice. She left the stand, her face a pale, composed mask, and sat down, her hands clenched in her lap to keep them from shaking. Eben watched it all, a helpless, volcanic rage building in his chest. He took the stand next, his testimony a raw, angry corroboration of Asha's. He faced the men who remembered his old compromise, the men who now saw him as a traitor. Davies tried to use his past against him, but Eben met it head-on. "Yes, I signed a paper I shouldn't have," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction he had never felt before. "I was a coward then. I stood still, and I have spent every day since trying to pay for it. But I am not standing still now. I am telling you that these men, these concerned citizens, are murderers. And if you let them walk free, then her blood, and Sarah Gable's blood, is on all of your hands." He risked everything in that moment. As he left the hall that evening, 3 of the regulators cornered him in an alley. They did not speak. They simply beat him. A brutal, methodical punishment for his betrayal, leaving him bruised and bleeding in the dirt. The most violent counterattack, however, came not for him, but for those who had shown kindness. The regulators, sensing the tide might be turning against them, decided to make a final, terrible example. One night, a fire broke out at the Miller farm. It was not the house this time, but the barn. Mr. Miller managed to get the livestock out, but the building, full of dry hay, went up like a torch. In the smoke and chaos, young Thomas, the boy Asha had saved, was overcome. They found him near the barn door, his small lungs full of smoke. He died before the sun came up. The loss was unbearable. It was a vicious, targeted cruelty that proved justice would not come cleanly, if it came at all. Asha felt the boy's death like a physical blow, a negation of the one good thing she felt she had accomplished in this town. The small flicker of hope she had nurtured was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard despair. Eben, his face swollen and cut, his body a symphony of aches, found her sitting by the creek that evening, staring into the dark, flowing water. He sat beside her, saying nothing for a long time. The silence between them was no longer one of caution, but of shared, bottomless grief. Later that night, in the blacksmith's small back room where she had been sleeping, he brought her a bowl of thin stew. His movements were stiff with pain. She looked at his bruised face, at the gash above his eye that was still seeping blood. "Let me," she said, her voice a near whisper. She took a clean cloth and a basin of warm water. She began to clean his wounds, her touch incredibly gentle. She worked in silence, her movements careful and deliberate. As she dabbed at the cut on his face, he reached up and caught her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against her own. His hand covered hers, holding it against his cheek, not to possess, but to anchor, to clean a cut near his shoulder. She had to unbutton his shirt. She did so without hesitation, her focus on the task. The act was clinical, a necessity of care. As she worked, her own scarf, worn loosely, slipped from her shoulder, exposing the pale, puckered line of the scar on her collarbone. He saw it. His fingers, still holding her other hand, traced the air just above the old wound, not daring to touch it. "Who?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She did not answer the question directly. Instead, she looked him in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "We all have them," she said softly. "The wounds that make us—" In that moment, in the quiet, lamp-lit room, a new kind of intimacy was born between them. It was a thing of consent and mutual care, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared, broken histories. She was not a victim to be saved, and he was not a hero seeking redemption. They were simply 2 people, scarred and wounded by the world, finding a moment of grace in the act of tending to each other. It was a tenderness that was restorative, a healing that went far deeper than the skin. She finished dressing his wounds. He slept in a chair by the door, a silent guardian. The next morning, Asha woke with a strange, unfamiliar feeling. For the first time since she had arrived in this land, She had a flicker of a sense of safety, but it was a fragile thing, laced with the terrifying knowledge of how quickly it could be taken away. Eben, watching her as she woke, felt a lessening of the brittle hardness that had encased his heart for years, but he was haunted by the memory of the boy, by the knowledge of how close he had come, once again, to failing to protect the innocent. The judge delivered his verdict a week later. It was, as the sheriff had predicted, a matter of balance. Jed Stone and one other regulator were found guilty of manslaughter in the death of Silas Gable and sentenced to 10 years in the federal prison. But the leaders, the men who had planned the raids and fanned the flames of hatred, evaded all punishment, the judge citing a lack of direct evidence. Sheriff Brody was officially censured for his negligence, but was not removed from his post. The town was changed, but the deepest roots of its injustice remained. The victory was hollow, bittersweet, but it was not nothing. In a private settlement brokered by the judge, the Ranchers Association and the Mercantile were forced to pay a small measure of compensation to Daniel Gable, enough for him to start a new life elsewhere, and in a public gesture of reconciliation, the town council, prodded by Judge Morrison, agreed to fund a small stone monument to be placed on the empty lot where the boarding house had stood, dedicated to the memory of Sarah Gable. An uneasy truce settled over the town's miners, farmers, and ranchers. The raw wound was closed, but the scar would be ugly and permanent. Many questions remained. The landscape was still harsh, the wind still cut with a razor's edge, but in the barren, fire-scorched earth where a good woman's home had stood, a tiny, hard-won seed of hope had been planted. The seasons turned, pulling redemption slowly, unevenly, out of the shadow of its grief. A year passed, then another. Life returned, as it always does. But the town was a changed place. Children played tag in the dusty street again, their laughter a bright, thin thread in the quiet air. The Mercantile had a new owner, a nervous man who gave credit too easily. The blacksmith's hammer rang out with its steady, percussive rhythm, a sound like a stubborn heartbeat. But the scars remained. The lot where Sarah Gable's boarding house had stood was empty, marked only by a simple stone monument that bore her name. The miller's homestead sat abandoned, its windows boarded up, a testament to a loss the town was still too ashamed to speak of aloud. Empty lots dotted the streets where families had quietly packed up and moved on. Unwilling to live with the ghosts of what had happened, the town was healing, but like a poorly set bone, it would always walk with a limp. Asha and Eben attempted to build a life in the middle of it all. They took over a small, neglected plot of land by the creek, the one the German family had been driven from, securing the title with the compensation money Daniel Gable had insisted they share. Their life was not one of idyllic peace, but of constant, practical struggle. Eben's reputation as a troublemaker meant that steady work was hard to come by. The water rights, though no longer openly contested, were a source of simmering tension, and in the second year, a new drought settled over the plains, turning the creek into a muddy trickle and the earth to baked clay. Threats from Caldwell's expanding plantation were no longer violent, but they were ever present. A low offer to buy their land. A fence line moved a few feet in the night. Their life together was a quiet negotiation, a weaving of two different worlds. In the evenings, Asha would teach Eben the Komanche words for the stars, her voice soft in the darkness. He, in turn, showed her how to brace a fence post so it would stand against the relentless wind. Their home was a tiny, sod house they built with their own hands, a place that honored her need for connection to the earth and his need for solid, defensible walls. They worked together to create a small refuge, a thing that was not about fighting but about building. With the help of the blacksmith and a few other families, they spent months digging a new, deeper well on their property, hitting a clean, cold aquifer that the drought had not yet touched. They declared it a community well, open to anyone, with no questions asked. It was a small act, but it became a new center for the town's outcasts and its quiet dissenters. Freighters watered their horses there. Comanche families passing through would stop to fill their skins, and homesteaders who had been denied credit at the mercantile could always find help. It was a place of slow, daily justice, a cup of cold water offered against the heat of the world. The final confrontation with the town's prejudice came not with a torch or a gun, but with a tailored suit and a leather satchel full of contracts. A man named Harrison arrived on the train, a wealthy investor from the east representing the railroad's expansion interests. He was smooth and confident. With a smile that never quite reached his eyes, he called a town meeting, laying out a grand vision for the future of redemption. He spoke of a new rail spur, a grain elevator, a hotel. He spoke of progress and prosperity. And then he made his offer. The railroad was prepared to buy out the entire town, every house, every business, every plot of land, for a price that was, on the surface, quite generous. "This is a chance to start fresh," he said, his voice resonating with persuasive charm. "To leave the past behind and invest in a modern future. We will build a new town, a better town, on this spot." The offer was a powerful temptation to a community that was bone-weary and haunted. The promise of profit, of an easy way out, was seductive. Mr. Sterling, the former merchant, spoke up in favor of the deal, his voice full of greed. Caldwell, the plantation owner, saw a chance to consolidate his holdings. One by one, people began to murmur their assent. Harrison smiled, sensing his victory. "There is just one small matter," he said, looking at a map. "This one plot of land here, by the creek. It is essential for our plans. We will, of course, compensate the owners, Mr. Eben and his associate." All eyes turned to Eben and Asha, who stood at the back of the hall. This was the final test. To sell would be to admit defeat, to allow their hard-won sanctuary to be paved over for profit. To refuse would be to stand against the entire town. Eben stepped forward. He was no longer the silent, watchful man who had stood on the train platform years ago. His face was leaner, weathered by the sun and by hardship, but his eyes were clear. "My name is Eben," he began, his voice steady. "And this is Asha, my wife." The word, spoken so simply and publicly for the first time, settled in the quiet room with a profound weight. "Mr. Harrison offers you a future. He offers you money to forget the past. I am here to tell you that the past is the only thing that can teach you how to build a future worth having." He took a deep breath. "Many of you know I once signed a paper that took land from a Comanche family. It was the act of a coward, and I have to live with it every day. I chose profit, a week's pay, over what was right, and I saw what came of it. I saw this town choose profit and convenience over its own people. I saw it stand still while Silas Gable was murdered. I saw it stand still while Sarah Gable's home was burned to the ground. I saw it stand still while a child froze to death because his family was in the way." His voice was raw, full of a pain that was both personal and communal. "This piece of land you want, Mr. Harrison, is not for sale. Not because of the price, but because of the cost. It cost this town 2 good women, a boy, and its own soul to learn that some things are not for sale. Decency is not for sale. Justice is not for sale. A cup of cold water to a thirsty neighbor is not for sale." Asha moved to stand beside him, her hand resting on his arm. She looked out at the faces of her neighbors, her gaze steady and unafraid. "We are not asking you to stand with us," Eben finished, his voice dropping. "We are asking you to stand with yourselves, with the memory of those you lost. Choose decency. Choose each other. Do not sell your souls for a handful of silver." He said no more. The silence that followed was different from the one that had followed his first confession. It was deeper, more thoughtful. The town, for the first time, was forced to look at itself, at the full ledger of its choices. A few weeks later, Asha knew she had to make one last journey. She needed to perform the final ritual of remembrance for her family, to find a closure that was not triumphant, but whole. Eben did not offer to come with her to the camp. He simply asked what she needed. He prepared her a pack with food and water, and he rode with her for the first day. His presence a quiet, steady support. He left her at the mouth of the canyon, promising to return in 2 days' time. In the familiar, smoky quiet of the Komanche camp, with the woman called She Who Remembers, Asha built a small spirit lodge. It was a private, deeply spiritual act. She fasted. She prayed. She spoke the names of her family, not with grief, but with love, releasing their spirits from the earthly pain of their passing and freeing herself from the burden of her own survival. It was an acceptance, a letting go, a final, quiet settling of her heart. When Eben returned, he found her sitting by a small, dying fire, her face serene. He said nothing. He simply handed her a canteen of fresh water and a warm blanket, and waited for her to be ready to leave. On the ride back, they made camp for the night under a huge, clear sky, the stars like a spill of diamonds on black velvet. They sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable and deep. "The hurts that brought us together," Asha said softly, looking up at the vastness above them. "They almost destroyed us." "My pride almost destroyed us," Eben corrected her, his voice full of a humility he had not possessed before. "My need to fix things, to own things, even to own your safety. And my fear," she admitted, "my fear of trusting anyone, of letting anyone close enough to see the scars." They talked for hours, their voices low, weaving the story of their journey together. They spoke of the coat, of the bread, of the angry words and the quiet acts of care. The vows they made to each other that night were not of possession, not of forever, but of mutual respect. They promised to honor each other's boundaries, to care for each other's wounds, and to always, always choose the hard, honest truth over the easy silence. Later, in the darkness of their bedrolls, he reached for her. It was not an act of desire, but of connection. His touch was a question, and her response was a quiet consent. Their physical intimacy was an outcome of all the healing that had come before, a tender, non-explicit affirmation of their hard-won trust. It was the feeling of a hand on a scarred collarbone, not with pity, but with reverence. It was the safety of being held by someone who had seen the worst of you and had not looked away. It was two broken halves, finally, gently, becoming whole. The novel of their life in redemption did not close on a grand victory, but on a scene of fragile, enduring hope. The railroad's offer was eventually rejected, the town choosing its own difficult, uncertain future over a profitable erasure. The landscape was still harsh, the wind still cut like a knife, and the coming winter promised to be long, but the new fence line Eben had built around their property held firm against the wind. In Asha's small garden by the well, a few stubborn seedlings were pushing their way through the dust. In the evenings, the lights of the small town reflected in the slow-moving water of the creek, a small constellation of survival in the vast darkness. Justice had been partial. The losses remained, aching and real. But in a small sod house built on a foundation of mutual care, love and dignity had survived. The final image was this: Eben and Asha walking along the ridgeline above their small property as the sun went down. The wind was picking up, tugging at their coats. His hand reached for hers, not to clasp or to possess, but to steady her against the wind, and her hand met his, to steady him right back. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from to connect with others. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.